there was some concerns. Flair sometimes would concern that Dusty's getting his hand raised every night and beating us, and maybe a little bit of angst that if that continues, that all of a sudden we're going to lose our steam, and everybody in this business knows that once you get to that level, if you lose that steam, sometimes it's difficult, and in some cases almost impossible to get it back. And once you get to that level, you don't ever want to be in that position where you fall prey to that. And so the guys sometimes, I was caught between a rock and a hard place, because Dusty was the booker. I had a great personal relationship with Dusty and a great professional relationship with him. And my office was right next to Dusty's, and I shared an office with Gene Anderson. And every now and then, Flair would, because, Flair was Flair, and probably the biggest star that ever came out of the Mid-Atlantic area. And he would express concern that, God, Dusty's beating us every night, and all of a sudden, we're going to all of a sudden have the whole thing collapse and then not be able to get it back. And I had the ability of listening to the guys in the dressing room, and then they would say to me, because I'm in the office every day with Dusty, and they would say to me, well, don't you ever talk to him? I had a great relationship with Dusty, but it wasn't the kind of thing where I could have walked into his office, closed the door, and basically had any conversation with Dusty, because we were that close too. But I never in my wildest dreams would have thought of going in and closing the door and say, Dusty, God, you're beating us every night. You sure that's such a good idea? It just, I wouldn't have been comfortable doing that. And so I had a great relationship with Jimmy Crockett, and business was so good. And this would happen maybe once every 6 months, every 9 months. It wasn't like it was a regular thing once a month having to do this. I would, because Dusty would finish and he would leave, and I'd be in the office with Gene, and Jimmy would be there, and I'd say to Jimmy, can I have a couple of minutes with you? Yes, come in, close the door. What's going on? And I would tell him, I'd say, I'm in the dressing room with Flair, and Flair is saying that Dusty's a glory hound, and he's beating us every night, and we're going to die off and not be able to get our heat back, and asking me, don't you say something to Dusty? And so I could share the mood and how intense that mood was with Jimmy Crockett. And Jimmy would listen to me, and he'd say, okay, thank you. That's all he'd say. And I wouldn't ask him, what are you going to do about it? It just was, and this was not something that I went in every couple of weeks or every month. This would be something where I would realize that Flair was now it was getting to a boiling point. And before it got to that boiling point, I wanted to make Jimmy aware of it. And next day in the dressing, or like we maybe have a day off or something, and Rick would come to the dressing room, and he'd be like a whole different person. And he'd say, he said, I used to be close to Jimmy Crockett, and he'd say I'd have dinner with him and Myra all the time, and he called me and he said, hey, we haven't done it for a while. Why don't you come on over to the house and have dinner? And I went over, and, I talked a few things about business. And by the time I was done, Jimmy had me feeling so good about everything we'd accomplished and how well things were going, and how he was watching what was going on and wouldn't let things get out of hand. And so I'm sitting there listening, and I didn't tell him that I had a private conversation with Jimmy. And Jimmy knew what to say to Flair to put Flair at ease, that everything was okay, that Jimmy was on top of it. It wasn't like Dusty was running with the ship and it was out of Jimmy's control. And Jimmy would know when was the right time to go and have a private conversation with Dusty about, we got to be careful. We don't want to take the steam off of these guys, and whether it was doing that little angle on TV to put some steam back on us or what. But it was like I had a great relationship with Dusty. I didn't need to have all the other guys know that, I'm tight with Dusty and everything is cool. No, I never said anything to anybody about anything. Just business was good. I had no complaints, and I just knew when the conversation, because I'm with the heels in the dressing room with Flair, and sometimes Flair would be the one to kind of fuel it, where guys, Dusty's going to kill us off. He's beating us every night, leaving, we're bleeding, and then he's beating us too, and we're left laying in the ring, and he's going to kill our heat, and we'll never get it back. I had a sense of, somebody like Flair would push the panic button, and at the same time I understood Ric's concern too. And I would convey it, and it may, like I say, it might be once in 9 months, but I would finally pull Jimmy off and I'd say, Jimmy, you got a little problem. And, usually I can listen to him, and the guy said, well, you're there with him. Don't you talk to him every day? and I wouldn't, every time that happened, go to Jimmy. I would sense when it was reaching a boiling over point. And before somebody did something or said something stupid, I would go to Jimmy. And then it would be something as simple as Jimmy going into Flair and say, you haven't been over to the house with Myra and I to have dinner for a while. Why don't you come over? And Ric would go over, and Jimmy knew the right things to say to Ric to kind of put Ric's mind at ease. The business was great and all was well, and Ric would have a chance to maybe make a comment about getting beat every night, and Jimmy could just say, hey, I'm watching it. I'm not going to let it get out of hand. And that would be enough to put Ric's mind at ease. And Ric never knew that I had that conversation with Jimmy, and that I then let Jimmy handle it.